to Belfast, to the North of Ireland, to meet with people who have suffered things beyond my imagination well before I was ever in Guantanamo. I first met Jerry after having been represented by the same lawyer, Gareth Pearce, who's also here, who told me back in 1998 when I first met her, campaigning on a particular case, she said that it was the Irish first, but you are next, meaning the Muslim community. And of course, that was an ominous statement that she was completely right about, because unbeknownst to all of us, the war on terror was yet to be launched, and the effects of that war on terror were going to have its far-reaching effects on every single one of us, and it still has not stopped. You may have seen, as you came in, a film that was rolling about a man called Shakir Ahmed, who's a British resident and has been held in Guantanamo for 11 years without charge or trial or meaningful communication with his family, in solitary confinement, in a place where he still doesn't know if he'll ever be released. And this is in 2013, after presidents and prime ministers have come and gone who began the war on terror. He's still there, and so are 165 other prisoners. And in order to try to fight for their rights, one of the methods that they've used and are using as we speak, and have been doing so for the past 4 months now, continuously, are the hunger strikes. Now, people here know very well why people hunger strike, for what reason, and what are the effects of the hunger strike, and what are the goals, and what are the what ultimately can happen if it goes to its natural end, and that is death. 9 people have died in Guantanamo, not of the hunger strike, but for various reasons. Some say it's been murder, others say suicide. But what they do to break the hunger strike this time around is that they force the prisoners into a chair, they tie them and strap down their arms, and strap their legs, and strap their heads, and force into the nose a tube, which is then inserted through the throat into the stomach, and liquid food is pumped in. And then that tube is forced out with all the blood and the snot and everything else that's on it, and then pushed into the next prisoner. And it is an extremely painful process which the United Nations has described as torture. Now that's in addition to the torture of being held without charge or trial, of being beaten and abused and waterboarded in the past, and stripped naked and violated, and all of the things that have passed. That's in addition to that. And in addition to being held without charge or trial, which is the greatest torture. And it continues. But what we tend to forget here is, because there's been a change of government since Blair came in and went, is the involvement of the British intelligence services in all that transpired. How much the British government has been involved in rendition and torture and false imprisonment. And if you or I was to do that to a person, if we were to, any of us were to kidnap a person and hold him without his will in a room and beat him and abuse him, we'd be charged, prosecuted and punished for kidnapping, false imprisonment and torture. But because a government does it, and another government helps it, i.e. our government, then somehow they continuously are able to get away with it. And the British intelligence services have often, more times than we can mention, been involved in a complicit manner. I know here they use the word collusion, but in complicity in torture. And it continues in a very subliminal way. We find, you may have heard of the case of the Woolwich killing that took place, a horrific attack that took place on the streets of London. What you might not be aware of is of MI5's role in that. Now this case has gone to court, so there's not that much we can discuss, but what I can tell you is this, that the person who's alleged to have committed the killing, his friend came on BBC Newsnight and said that my friend was in Kenya and was beaten and abused and sexually abused and tortured, and the British intelligence services knew about it and were complicit. And that's what made him flip, because he said, and I quote, he never forgave them for that. It doesn't justify what he did, but it does go some way to explaining it. What was really concerning is that when he gave this interview, the moment he gave this interview, in the BBC studios in London, waiting inside, in the building, were the police forces, Scotland Yard, to come and arrest him immediately after he gave that interview. So he's in prison now. And this, and many other things, shows the involvement of the intelligence services constantly and continuously and repetitively in abuse and torture continues. And I know that they have a centre here in Belfast itself. And one of the things that my organisation, CagePrisoners, tries to do, we get often people coming to us saying that we've been harassed, and they use the word harassed, by the intelligence services. They put pressure upon us. They say that we could make your life difficult, or your life could become difficult if you don't cooperate with us, if you don't become a snitch, if you don't become a stooge working for us, if you don't become a plant within your community. And everybody knows, nobody likes a spy. I understand intelligence services have to do their job to protect the country, at least as their remit is concerned. But to try to implant within the community spies can only cause destruction. It can only cause people to be suspicious of one another. And when that starts happening, it leads to things that are more destructive of society. And this is part of the work that we're doing in England. We are trying to look at how the government has moved along from one that claims to be a bastion of freedom, democracy and human rights to introducing things like the Security and Justice Act, which is an introduction of secret courts into the British legal system. And it happened directly as a result of the Guantanamo cases, whereby we took the government to court and they realized that too much evidence was coming out that showed beyond any doubt that the British government knew exactly what was happening when we were being tortured in Guantanamo and Bagram. So they now have introduced a new act in Parliament, the Justice and Security Act, which will seek to hear such cases in future in secret. So if you want to hold the government to account for what they did, and you want to see justice for a government that should be held to account for complicity in torture, it's now going to be heard in secret, meaning you or your lawyers won't get to know what are the details of the case, who was involved in your torture, who sanctioned it, who approved it, who knew it was happening and should have done something about it. You'll never know. It'll all be down to the judge, to the secret judge, to the judges who hear the secret evidence. And this is, we're talking about after all of the experiences that have gone through the United Kingdom, the experiences that they've had in the north of Ireland. You would have thought that the British government would have learnt those lessons of the past, not in order for them to introduce such courts again. You can see recently the G8 had a discussion about several issues. One of the things that I've been talking about in the past is the British government's involvement in rendition abroad. So I've gone to Libya, I've gone to Tunisia, I've gone to Egypt, I've been to Syria and met with prisoners who were directly renditioned by the British or the American governments to those countries where they were renditioned to torture. And this was one of the threats that was made against me when I was held in Bagram. While my hands were tied behind my back, my legs were shackled, and a hood was placed over my head, and I was being punched and kicked. And in the room next to me, I heard the sounds of a woman screaming that they led me to believe was my wife being tortured. They brought pictures of my wife and kid and waved them in front of me and said, "Where do you think they are now? Do you think you're going to see them again? What do you think happened to them the night we took you from your house?" All the while, they were trying to pressurize me or to get me to confess to being a member of a terrorist organization. And what I knew about the involvement of these people in this is that it wasn't just happening to me. It was happening to people all over the world. They were bringing people from all over the world into the background detention facility and torturing them in this manner and getting them to make false confessions. So when we're talking about stuff like this, and I know I welcome the initiative of the Justice Watch for Ireland, and we've talked about miscarriages of justice, but in Guantanamo and places like this, there is no miscarriage of justice because there's no justice. There's no legal process. There's no court. Nobody's been released from Guantanamo as a result of any legal proceedings at all. And in fact, what you've got is governments making deals about who is and who isn't going to be released. Justice, courts, defense, advocacy, prosecution, judges have nothing to do with it at all. It's got nothing to do with justice at all. It's simply got to do with the power of the governments to be able to do what they wish to do. So as I was saying, that I've been to these countries and have seen and met with people who were imprisoned as a result of the rendition and the complicity between the British government. And yes, I've come across cases where people were even interned in Syria and in Libya as a result of British government involvement. So they were all working together with various regimes of disrepute when it suited them. And these cases have yet to come to light. And one of the things that I often say to people who come to us quite regularly about being visited by the intelligence services, after they express how afraid they are, they don't know what to do, they actually become very afraid, is I tell them to document it, to note it down, to write it down, and to pass it on to us. And we will make sure that we build up a database of all of these hundreds, in fact thousands of visitations by the intelligence services, and start to filter them through and see a pattern. Because we do know that they watch us constantly. They've introduced laws like in the 2000 Terrorism Act, Schedule 7, which some of you may have been subjected to, where you can arbitrarily be detained at the airport simply based upon, well, nothing. On how you look, how you speak, what you appear to be like, and take you away into a room and hold you there for up to 9 hours and ask you questions that they couldn't do without the presence of a lawyer in any other circumstance. And they can do that at any port of entry or exit in the country, and you have no way to challenge it. The only thing you could do is if you say, "I refuse to answer your questions," is face up to 2 years imprisonment for doing so. So this is the stage at which we're at. But what I tell people when they come along and complain about such things is to document it, to ensure that it's not forgotten. And organizations like Miscarriages of Justice and others who are helping the prisoners recognize that indeed, when you're going through these processes, you become the victim. You become the victim. But just as they are watching us, I ask people that we need to tell them that we're watching them right back. Thank you.